Pedro Mendoza was a name the desert wind seemed to have striven to erase. At 50, his face was a map of deep furrows, carved more by grief than by time, and his eyes, once mirrors of a proud father, were now dull, hollowed-out pits, devoid of any light. He inhabited a small house on the edge of a forgotten Mexican town, where dust covered not only the streets, but also hope itself. A former watchman at a factory slowly being consumed by rust, Pedro was now the keeper of his own ruins, a man who moved like a shadow among the living, imprisoned in the silence that had settled in his soul the day the music of his daughter's laughter was brutally silenced forever. The pain he carried was a constant companion, an echo in the emptiness of his home, a wound that would not scar over. There were days when the silence was so deafening, he thought he would go mad. It was a silent scream in the void of his existence, a testament to a loss so profound it had hollowed out his very soul. This grief was his only confidant, a perpetual lonely vigil he was sentenced to keep for the rest of his days, a constant reminder of the life that had been stolen from him. His routine was a monotonous ritual of survival. He would wake with the merciless sun that invaded his window, swallow bitter coffee without tasting it, and walk the dirt streets, avoiding the gazes of the few who still remembered him as the man who lost everything. He had become a spectre in the landscape of his own life, a ghost, haunted not by chains, but by the vivid memory of a violence that the justice of men refused to punish. Every step was heavy, every breath a reminder that he continued to exist in a world where his reason for living had been carved out with unspeakable cruelty, leaving him empty inside. The town, in turn, seemed complicit in his melancholy. The peeling facades of the buildings told stories of a progress that never arrived, and the central plaza, with its abandoned bandstand, was a monument to decay. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of dry dust and resignation. During the day, the sun punished, bleaching the colors and forcing life to hide in the shadows. At night, the darkness took over completely, a thick mantle that seemed to swallow the starlight and the sordid secrets of its inhabitants. It was a place where hope was a luxury and justice a joke told by the corrupt in the noisy cantina. Fragments of the past assaulted him without warning, a glimpse of a colored ribbon in a girl's hair, the distant sound of a song his daughter loved. Everything was a trigger that reopened the wound. He would see her smile, hear her voice calling Papa, and the reality of her absence would hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless. These memories were both treasures and tortures, the only trace of light in his bleak existence, but each one was a knife that twisted in his chest, a constant and cruel reminder of the brutality that had stolen his joy and purpose, transforming his paternal love into an eternal, inconsolable grief. His old job at the abandoned factory had taught him the secrets of the night. For years, he had walked the silent corridors and dark yards, learning to decipher the sounds of the darkness, to move without being seen, to become part of the shadows. That knowledge, once used to protect worthless machines and inventory, lay dormant within him, a latent skill forged in solitude and observation. He knew every shortcut, every blind spot, every echo the night produced. The factory, a skeleton of twisted metal, had been his school, and the darkness his teacher, preparing him for a war he never imagined he would have to fight. The factory was now a mirror of his soul, a vast, empty and ruined place, holding the echoes of a life that no longer existed. Sometimes, at dusk, he would find himself standing before the rusty gates, watching as the shadows lengthened and took over the structure, just as bitterness had taken over his heart. The skills he acquired there, the patience of waiting in the dark, the ability to hear the inaudible, were the tools of a forgotten trade. But in his grief, these tools were not lost. They were merely waiting for a new, terrible purpose, being sharpened by his silent fury. Night would fall on the town, and with it a subtle change would occur in Pedro. The apathetic, broken man who wandered during the day gave way to a different kind of stillness, more alert, more tense. Sitting in the gloom of his room, he didn't just see the darkness outside. He felt it, understood it. It was his element, his refuge. The world fell asleep, the sounds quieted, but inside Pedro, the storm of rage and grief was always awake. He was a man on the edge, a powder keg of sorrow and fury, and on this night, fate would finally give him the final push that would launch him into the abyss of revenge. The night began to weave its long shadows over the town as Pedro, on his aimless walk, found himself drawn to the central plaza, a place he usually avoided like an open wound. Under the yellowish light of the lampposts, a semblance of normal life unfolded. Children ran, couples shared secrets on iron benches, and the sound of distant music drifted from the cantina. For Pedro, that scene was a painting of a world to which he no longer belonged. He remained on the periphery, a silent observer, feeling the chasm between their normality and his perpetual emptiness. The air was warm, but an icy cold emanated from his chest, insulating him from any human warmth that might exist there. It was then that he saw him. Ricardo Torres. The name, a burning ember in his mind, now had a face before him. The colonel's son, the personification of impunity, stood at the center of a circle of friends, exuding arrogance and privilege. And then he laughed. A loud, uninhibited laugh that cut through the night air and struck Pedro with the precision of a bullet. That sound was the final desecration, an act of contempt on his daughter's grave, a celebration of injustice. In that instant, Pedro's passive mourning crystallized into a pure, cutting hatred. The fog of pain that enveloped him dissipated, revealing a terrible and sharp clarity. The world around Ricardo Torres disappeared. The sounds of the plaza, the lights, the people, everything became an insignificant blur. The only real thing for Pedro was the echo of that laughter in his head, a sound that mocked his powerlessness and his suffering. His hands, hanging at his sides, clenched into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. He remained motionless for a long moment, a statue of contained fury, feeling the exact instant when sadness transformed into purpose. Without a word, he turned and began to walk back home, his steps no longer dragging with grief, but propelled by a new and somber determination. Back in the safety of his dark house, Pedro did not turn on the light. He moved with a fluidity he hadn't known in years, each movement deliberate and precise. He knelt before an old wooden chest that held the tools of his past life. With steady hands, he opened the creaking lid, revealing his old watchman's equipment, the sturdy flashlight, the worn leather gloves, a coil of rope. His fingers passed over these familiar objects, but sought something deeper. He took a hunting knife with a bone handle, an object he had never intended to use. As he held the cold steel, the decision was sealed. If the justice of men was blind and corrupt, he would become the sight in the darkness. That was his silent vow. He would no longer be a victim waiting for a miracle. He would be the consequence. The ritual of preparation was methodical, almost sacred. On the wooden table, he laid out his tools, those of his old life and that of the new. The knife, now clean and gleaming in the little light that entered through the window, was the centerpiece. He dressed in dark, functional clothes, erasing any trace of the man he was. The face in the cracked mirror was no longer that of Pedro Mendoza, the grieving father. It was an impenetrable mask of resolution, his eyes fixed on a single goal. As he stepped out the back door and was swallowed by the night, he was no longer a factory watchman. He was a hunter, and the town, which for so long had been his prison of pain, would now become his hunting ground. The hunt for Ricardo Torres was an exercise in patience and precision. Pedro, using his mastery of the darkness, began to follow the young man's every step. He watched from the shadows of alleys, from the tops of abandoned buildings, becoming an invisible ghost who mapped his target's arrogant routine. He learned his schedules, his habits, the places he frequented to show off. Every moment of observation was both torture and fuel, the sight of Ricardo's impunity sharpening the blade of his rage. Pedro was in no hurry. Vengeance for him was not an act of impulse, but a dish to be served in the cold silence of the night, far from the eyes of a world that had already failed to judge. He moved with the economy of a natural predator. The sound of his steps was absorbed by the dust of the streets, his silhouette blending with the irregular shapes of the decaying architecture. Ricardo, immersed in his own importance, never noticed the pair of eyes that followed him, eyes that held the reflection of the personal hell he himself had created. Pedro studied the vulnerabilities not of the target, but of the environment around him. He identified the dead-end alley behind the noisiest cantina, a blind spot in the corrupt police's patrol routes. It was there. That would be the stage, the courtroom, and the grave. The wait was part of the ritual, a period of grief and fury condensing into a deadly calm. The chosen night was moonless. Ricardo, stumbling drunk and loudly saying goodbye to his friends, entered the alley to relieve himself, a casual act of disrespect that would be his last. From the deepest blackness, a shape materialized. There was no scream. Pedro's hand was swift, covering Ricardo's mouth with brutal force as he dragged him into the denser shadows. The terror in the young man's eyes was Pedro's first reward. There, in the darkness, his father's money and the power of his name were useless. He was just flesh and fear, confronted by a silent judge whose sentence had already been written in tears and blood. The confrontation was brief, efficient, and devoid of any scream or plea. Pedro didn't want to hear his voice, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of a word. His justice was delivered with the hunting knife, a cold instrument for an act driven by incandescent pain. Every movement was a response to the memory of his daughter, a settling of accounts with the system that had abandoned him. Ricardo Torres, the untouchable, collapsed in a pathetic silence. Pedro looked at what he had done, the inert body at his feet, and did not feel the relief he had imagined. There was only a cold void, the realization that revenge could punish the guilty, but it could never restore the innocence that was lost. With the same cold methodology, he dealt with the body. Using the ropes from his old trade, he wrapped the corpse and, under the cover of night, transported it to the heart of the abandoned factory. There, amidst the rusted machinery that symbolized the death of the town's prosperity, he hid Ricardo's remains. It was a symbolic burial, the rot joining the rot. Returning home, with the first light of day staining the sky, Pedro felt more empty than ever. The first page of his revenge had been turned, but the book of his pain remained open, the chapter of loss impossible to erase. Justice was just a drop of blood in an ocean of suffering. The news of Ricardo Torres's disappearance fell on the town like a bomb. The colonel's son vanished. At first, there was disbelief, then a panic that settled first among the powerful. The colonel mobilized his resources, pressuring the police and offering a hefty reward. The town, which once whispered about Ricardo's arrogance, now fell silent in a respectful fear. The natural order of things had been violated. One of the wolves had been taken from the pack, and no one knew who the hunter was. Ricardo's absence created a shockwave that exposed the fragility of the power everyone believed to be absolute, and a new kind of fear began to spread. Captain Ramirez was one of the first to arrive at the cantina, the last place Ricardo was seen. A middle-aged man with a tired face and cynical eyes, Ramirez was a master at maintaining the fragile balance of power in the town. He listened to the reports, inspected the alley, and upon finding a small dark stain in the dust, he knew this was not a kidnapping for ransom. This was something different, something personal and brutal. The pressure from Colonel Torres was immense, but Ramirez sensed he was dealing with a force that didn't care about money or influence. He was hunting something born of desperation, and that made it dangerous and unpredictable. From the windows of his refuge, Pedro watched the commotion. He saw the police cars, the colonel's henchmen questioning people with poorly disguised violence, and he saw the fear in the eyes of other men, like Ricardo, men who moved through the town with the certainty of their impunity. In that fear, Pedro found a new and disturbing revelation. His act of personal revenge had echoed beyond its target. He had created a crack in the armor of corruption. The idea began to form in his mind. Perhaps his mission had not ended with Ricardo. Perhaps it had just begun. The pain of one family could become the shield of many others. Seeking silence, not absolution, Pedro entered the old town church. The air was cool and smelled of wax and old wood. Inside, Father Ignacio, an old man with eyes that seemed to know the weight of all the world's sins, was sweeping the altar. He saw Pedro and showed no surprise. The conversation between them was short, in coded phrases. "The night has been restless, my son," said the priest. "Sometimes, when the shepherds sleep, a faithful dog must protect the flock," Pedro replied, his voice hoarse. The priest sighed, a heavy sound of understanding. "Be careful that the dog, in its fury to hunt the wolf, does not become a monster itself." Alone again, the weight of the priest's words echoed in Pedro's mind. A monster. Was that what he was becoming? Vengeance had emptied him, not fulfilled him, but the sight of fear in the eyes of the guilty and the memory of his own daughter's vulnerability ignited something in him. This path had not been a choice, it was a sentence. He realized that if he was the only justice the forgotten people of this town would ever have, he couldn't stop now. He had to continue, not for himself, but for all those who had no one else to defend them from the wolves. The decision solidified. There were other names whispered in the dark corners of the town, other predators hiding in plain sight. The next was a loan shark who used debt to abuse the daughters of his debtors, a man whose cruelty was an open wound in the community. Pedro began his second vigil, but this time he was moved not only by the memory of his daughter, but by the frightened faces of other girls he saw on the streets. His hunt now had a broader purpose. He was no longer just a vengeful father, he was becoming against his own will, the dark guardian of the innocent in this godforsaken town. In the cantina, where fear and rumors fermented together, Elena worked. A young woman with a serious face and watchful eyes, she served drinks while absorbing the conversations. She heard the whispers about a watchman, a shadow that cleansed the town. For many, it was a horror story. For Eleanor, it was a spark of hope. Her younger sister, Anna, had caught the attention of one of the powerful men in town, and Eleanor lived in a constant state of dread. She looked out into the darkness, not with fear of the watchman, but with the silent prayer that he was real and that his justice would arrive in time to save her family. A few weeks later, the loan shark also disappeared, without a trace, like smoke in the wind. It was then that the legend was truly born. The name, the Watchman, ceased to be a whisper and became an identity, an invisible force that loomed over the town. For the criminals and the corrupt, it was a spectre that made them look over their shoulders. For the oppressed, it was an avenging angel, proof that someone, somewhere, heard their desperate prayers. Pedro, the man behind the myth, was unaware of the hope he inspired. He just continued his work, a grim and solitary task, driven by a need he himself barely understood. For Captain Ramirez, the situation was spinning out of control. Two influential men had vanished, both with sordid reputations. This was no coincidence. He began to profile the hunter, someone methodical who knew the town like the back of his hand, who moved at night without being seen, and who acted with military precision. Someone driven by his own moral code, a vigilante. The list of suspects was small in a town like this. Ramirez began to investigate old records, looking for men with the right skills, and, more importantly, with a motive strong enough to declare war on the system. The game of cat and mouse had truly begun. Elena's anguish reached a boiling point. One night, She overheard the man harassing her sister bragging in the cantina, saying he would soon tame the little one. Elena's blood ran cold. The police were a joke. They were paid by the same system that protected that monster. Desperation drove her to an unthinkable act. She had no one to turn to except the legend, the ghost. She had to contact the Watchman, and her intuition told her that a man seeking justice might frequent the only place of peace in town, the old church. With trembling hands, Elena wrote a note. On it, just a name and the address of an abandoned house where the man used to take his victims. It was a raw plea, a shot in the dark. That night, she went to the church and, in an act of blind faith, left the small folded paper in the offering box, praying that the right hands would find it. She wasn't asking for the man's death. She was asking for her sister's salvation. It was a message sent into the abyss, a prayer to a dark saint she hoped existed and was. Listening, days later, during one of his silent visits to the church, Pedro found the note. The hurried handwriting and the desperate message struck him in an unexpected way. Until now, his actions had been dictated by his own pain and his own judgment. Now, someone saw him as a solution, an instrument of justice. That small piece of paper was a heavier burden than any body he had ever carried. To accept it would mean crossing a new frontier, from a personal avenger to a champion of the defenseless. He sat on the cold church pew, the note in his hand, weighing not only the fate of a girl, but that of his own soul. He sought out Father Ignazio once more. He didn't show him the note, only asked, "Father, if a man finds a wolf about to attack a lamb, is it a sin to intervene?" The priest, polishing an old chalice, did not look at him as he replied, "The sin, my son, is to see the wolf and pretend you only saw a sheep. But the shepherd who uses violence to protect his flock risks staining not only his hands, but also his heart. The question is, what is left of a shepherd when his entire flock is gone and he only knows how to fight?" The enigmatic answer left Pedro even more alone with his decision. The choice was made. The shepherd inside him was dead, but the protector, forged in pain, still lived. Pedro began his surveillance of the note's target. This time, his planning was even more meticulous, for it was not about his own anger. He was acting on behalf of someone else's hope. He watched the man's movements, his casual cruelty, and felt the same cold fury he had felt for Ricardo. His technique was more refined, his senses sharper. He was no longer just a broken man seeking revenge. He was a weapon, and he had just been given a new target, aimed by the hand of a stranger's desperation. The intervention was surgical. Pedro did not kill the man. Instead, he cornered him in the abandoned house mentioned in the note, the scene of his crimes. There, in the darkness, he broke him, not just physically but psychologically. He marked him, leaving a visible scar as a permanent reminder of his transgression, and whispered a promise in his ear. If he ever came near that family again, the Watchman would return to finish the job. The man was found the next morning, babbling incoherently about a shadow with the devil's eyes. Pedro was evolving. His brutality now had a purpose beyond death, fear as a tool of protection. Meanwhile, Ramirez's investigation was leading him to a name, Pedro Mendoza, a former night watchman, a man with the right skills, and most importantly, a man with a soul shattered by the impunity that had benefited Ricardo Torres. The motive was crystal clear. Ramirez had no concrete proof, only the intuition of a veteran cop and a trail of circumstances that pointed directly to the silent house on the edge of town. He began to set up a discreet surveillance, feeling he was closing in on the ghost that haunted his town. The net was slowly tightening. Pedro felt the change in the air. The subtle but constant presence of Ramirez's men near his house did not go unnoticed. He, the observer, was now being observed. The pressure mounted exponentially. Every nightly outing was a calculated risk. Every shadow could hide an enemy. He was trapped in a two-front war, hunting the monsters of the town while being hunted by the only form of law that still functioned there. Exhaustion began to seep into his bones, a weariness that was not just physical, but came from the soul, from the weight of being both hunter and prey. It was during the surveillance of a new target, a henchman of the Torres family, that Pedro made an alarming discovery. He intercepted a conversation that revealed the abuses and exploitation were not isolated acts by depraved individuals. They were part of an organized operation, a network of trafficking and exploitation that served the richest and most powerful men in the region, all under the protective wing of Colonel Torres, Ricardo's father. The rot was deeper than he had ever imagined. It wasn't a cancer in a few organs, but a metastasis that had taken over the entire body of the town. His personal mission had collided with a monstrous conspiracy. The weight of this revelation almost crushed him. He looked at his reflection in a piece of broken glass and saw a stranger. An aged man, with eyes haunted by the violence he had committed and the violence he still had to commit. The revenge for his daughter now seemed like a small part of a much larger war. How many more would he have to punish? How many lives would he have to destroy to cleanse this town? The fight was emptying him, corroding his humanity, leaving behind only the shell of a man driven by a dark purpose. He wondered if there was still a way back, or if he was already lost forever in the desert of his actions. Despite the cost, a fleeting scene gave him the strength to continue. As he passed a playground that was once dominated by vandals, he saw children playing freely, their laughter echoing in the late afternoon air. He saw Elena walking with her younger sister, Anna, both smiling, the shadow of fear finally lifted from their faces. That image, that small proof that his actions had created a safe space, however small, was enough. He knew he couldn't stop. The Torres network was the source of the poison. To save the town, he would have to rip out the serpent's heart, even if it meant marching directly into its nest, into certain death. The night of the party at the Torres hacienda was a wound of light and sound in the darkness of the desert. Loud music and empty laughter spilled from the property, a celebration of the rot Pedro had come to purge. From his position on a nearby hill, he watched the nest of vipers. He brought not only his knife and his fury. In a leather pouch, he carried a small ledger he had recovered, a detailed record of the exploitation network, with names, dates, and figures. His plan was an act of total war, not just to decapitate the leadership, but to salt the earth, to expose the corruption in a way that not even the colonel's power could cover up. He was a one-man army, marching against an empire. The infiltration was a silent dance with death. He skirted the high walls, using the shadows cast by the party's own ostentatious lighting against them. Every guard bypassed, every camera avoided, was a small victory in the invisible war he waged. The smell of trimmed grass and expensive perfume contrasted with the smell of dust and sweat he carried. He moved through the luxurious gardens, a predator in the sinner's artificial paradise, feeling the pulse of the music like the heartbeat of the beast he had come to slay. The proximity to the enemy did not intimidate him, it only focused his mind, turning every drop of fear into fuel for the precision of his actions. Upon reaching the main courtyard, he paused for a moment, watching through a glass window the smiling, complacent faces. They were the men who devoured innocence as if it were a feast, toasting to their own impunity. There was no turning back. Tonight, he would become the monster they feared, so that no other daughter would have to face the monsters they truly were. If this was to be his final act, he would make it a fire that purified the very ground they stood on. With that grim prayer sealed in his heart, he shattered the glass and stormed the hall. The chaos was instant and absolute. The sound of shattering glass was followed by a scream, and the party turned into a pandemonium of panic. Pedro moved with a speed and brutality that paralyzed everyone. He was not an indiscriminate killer. His targets were precise: the colonel's key lieutenants, the enforcers of the network. The action was a blur of calculated violence. The security guards, accustomed to intimidating unarmed civilians, were no match for a man with nothing to lose. Amidst the expensive furniture and fine food, Pedro dismantled the Torres empire, staining opulence with the blood of retribution. He found Colonel Torres in his office, trying to make a call, his face pale with shock and fury. The imposing figure of the most powerful man in the region had shrunk, replaced by a frightened old man. The confrontation was not of fists, but of wills. "You don't know who you're messing with, you lunatic," the colonel snarled. "I know exactly," Pedro answered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I am the father of one of the girls your system destroyed. I am the result of your justice." In that moment, Pedro was not just a man. He was the personification of all the colonel's victims, a ghost who had come to collect an unpayable debt. At the height of the tension, as Pedro's hand closed, ready for the final blow, the shrill sound of sirens cut the air. Captain Ramirez, faster than Pedro had anticipated, had arrived with the police force, surrounding the hacienda. A smile of relief and triumph appeared on the colonel's face. He was saved by the same law he had always manipulated. Pedro was trapped. Inside, the remaining henchmen were regrouping, and outside, a police perimeter was closing in. He was caught between the anarchy of criminals and the order of a corrupt system, a dead end created by his own crusade. Time seemed to stop. Pedro looked at the colonel, the personification of his pain, and then at the ledger in his pouch, the only hope of justice for so many. Others, vengeance or justice, his daughter or the daughters of other men. In a moment of transformative clarity, he made his choice. He grabbed a heavy candelabra and hurled it through the office's main window, creating a loud distraction. As the police focused on the sound, he ran to the other end, lit a lighter, and set fire to the velvet curtains. In the ensuing chaos, as the flames began to lick at the office, he threw the ledger out the broken window, aiming for the darkness in the direction where Ramirez and his more honest men would be. Then he disappeared into the smoke, a ghost surrendering to the night once more. Captain Ramirez stood amidst the chaos of smoke and sirens, holding the scorched ledger. It was the proof that he, in his complacency, would never have had the courage to seek. The fire at the Torres hacienda was more than just a fire. It was a funeral pyre for the town's era of impunity. Ramirez looked at the faces of the powerful men, now stripped of their arrogance, reduced to frightened criminals. He did not find the watchman's body, only the trail of his war. In that moment, the cynical captain understood the choice of the ghost he had been hunting. He had not chosen personal revenge, but collective justice, leaving Ramirez with the responsibility of finishing the cleanup. The watchman was not just a killer, he was a catalyst. Wounded and bleeding, Pedro ran into the embrace of the desert. Each step was an agony, his body screaming for rest. But his will propelled him forward. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the battle now gave way to excruciating pain. The lights of the burning hacienda and the distant sirens were his last farewell to the world he had turned upside down. He did not look back. The desert, which had once represented the aridity of his life, was now his sanctuary, an immensity of sand and stars ready to swallow his name, his story, and his sins. He surrendered to the darkness, seeking not survival, but complete disappearance, becoming nothing more than an echo on the wind. Months passed. The dust in the town settled, but it was a different, cleaner dust. Pedro's ledger, used by a renewed Captain Ramirez, triggered a federal investigation that dismantled the Torres empire and imprisoned dozens of powerful men. The town breathed a lighter air. The name, the Watchman, transformed into legend, a dark nursery rhyme to frighten the wolves and give hope to the sheep. Elena and her sister now walked freely through the plaza, And Father Ignazio, in his nightly prayers, asked not for the soul of a sinner, but for the peace of a man who had sacrificed himself, disappearing so that others could finally find the light of day. Wherever Pedro is now, he is no longer the watchman. Perhaps he is an anonymous worker in a distant city, or perhaps he is one with the desert shadows. His personal war is over. The justice he forged with blood and pain brought him no peace or redemption, only the harsh clarity of the cost of his actions. He traded his soul for the safety of others, a bargain that would haunt him forever. He simply became the price that had to be paid so that others could live without fear. The story of Pedro Mendoza has no end, only a disappearance. He was never captured. To the world, he became a myth, a question mark. Some say he died that night in the desert. Others, that he still watches from the shadows, an eternal guardian. What remained was his legacy, a safer town, built on the ashes of a bloody vengeance. And the question that hangs in the dusty air is the same one that haunts all who know his story. When the law fails, who defines the line between a hero and a monster? The answer is lost in the silence, leaving only the enduring echo of one man's sacrifice.